The merciless Texas sun had transformed the earth into a furnace that seemed to stretch endlessly toward every horizon. Even the hardiest mesquite trees, those gnarled survivors that had weathered countless droughts and storms, appeared to wilt under the relentless heat that rose from the baked ground in shimmering waves. The air itself seemed to burn with each breath, and the landscape stretched out like a vision of biblical punishment, all browns and grays and the bleached white of bones scattered across the desert floor. Samuel Hartwell paused in his back-breaking work, wiping the sweat from his deeply weathered face with the back of his calloused hand. The fence post he had been wrestling with for the better part of 2 hours remained stubbornly crooked, a fitting metaphor for everything in his life that had gone sideways in recent years. At 43, Samuel carried himself like a man who had shouldered too much weight for too long. His broad shoulders, once proud and straight, now curved inward as if protecting some invisible wound, while his eyes, once bright with hope and determination, had taken on the hollow look of someone who had seen too much sorrow and expected little joy. The Broken Arrow Ranch had once been the pride of this corner of Texas, sprawling across several thousand acres of prime grazing land that had supported healthy herds of cattle and provided a comfortable living for Samuel, his beloved wife Martha, and their twin sons James and Jacob. But 3 consecutive years of drought had transformed the once lush grasslands into a moonscape of cracked earth and withered vegetation. The creek that had once run clear in cold year round now held nothing but sun, baked mud, and the white bones of fish that had died gasping in the gradually disappearing pools. 3 years had passed since consumption had crept through their valley like a merciless plague, taking first his cherished wife Martha and then, within the span of 2 terrible weeks, both of his sons. The disease had been swift and unforgiving, leaving Samuel alone with nothing but a struggling ranch, a house full of memories that cut like knives every time he walked through the rooms, and a grim determination born more of stubbornness than hope to keep the Broken Arrow running, despite every force of nature and economics that seemed arrayed against him. The rhythmic sound of his hammer against the metal fence post rang out across the empty landscape like a funeral bell, each strike echoing in the vast silence that had become the soundtrack of his existence. Samuel had grown accustomed to the profound quiet that surrounded him now, to the way conversations with himself had gradually replaced the laughter and chatter that had once filled his home with warmth and life. In town, the few times he ventured there for supplies or business, he had become known as a man of very few words, conducting his transactions with quiet efficiency before retreating once again to the isolation of his land. As he prepared to drive yet another post into the sun-baked earth, a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention and made him pause in his labor. At first glance, he thought it might be a coyote seeking shade, or perhaps one of his remaining cattle that had wandered away from the meager shelter provided by the barn. But as Samuel shielded his eyes against the blazing sun with one hand, squinting into the heat, distorted distance where mirages danced like ghostly lakes on the horizon, he saw something that made his heart skip several beats and his breath catch painfully in his throat. A small figure was making its way slowly but steadily across the burning ground, moving with the determined gait of someone on a mission of desperate importance. The heat rising from the baked earth created wavering distortions that made everything in the distance shimmer and dance like reflections on disturbed water, but there could be no mistaking what his eyes were telling him. It was a child, and that child was walking barefoot across ground so superheated that it could blister exposed skin within seconds of contact. Samuel dropped his tools without a second thought, the hammer and post forgotten as he broke into a run, his worn boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each stride. As he closed the distance between himself and the approaching figure, his worst fears were gradually and terrifyingly confirmed. It was indeed a little girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old by his best estimation, with a wild tangle of auburn hair that caught the brutal sunlight like spun copper, and a dress so worn and faded that appeared to be held together more by patches and prayers than by any original fabric. Her feet were completely bare, and even from several yards away, Samuel could clearly see the angry red welts and fresh blisters where the scorching earth had already begun its cruel work on her tender young skin. Yet she continued moving forward with a kind of grim determination that was simultaneously heartbreaking and inspiring. Each step forward an individual act of courage that left Samuel both amazed by her bravery and horrified by whatever circumstances had driven her to attempt such an impossible journey. "Child," Samuel called out when he was still 20 yards away, his voice cracking with emotion, but she didn't seem to hear him or acknowledge his presence in any way. She was focused entirely on the seemingly impossible task of placing one small, burned foot in front of the other. Her entire world narrowed down to the essential business of forward movement, despite pain that would have felled most grown men. When Samuel finally reached her side, he didn't hesitate for even a moment. Without asking permission or offering explanations, he scooped her up in his strong arms, immediately feeling how frighteningly light she was, how her small body trembled not just from the pain of her burns, but from what was obviously severe exhaustion, dehydration, and hunger. "What on earth are you doing out here, child?" he murmured, the question directed more to the merciless sky above than to the small bundle of courage he now carried. Her eyes, which he now saw were a startling and beautiful shade of green that reminded him of spring grass after the first rain following a long drought, looked up at him with an expression that somehow managed to mix wariness with desperate hope. "Can you help me?" she whispered in a voice so small and fragile that Samuel had to strain to hear the words over the sound of his own labored breathing. But those 4 simple syllables hit him with the devastating force of a lightning strike, carrying with them an emotional weight that seemed to crack something deep inside his chest that had been frozen solid for 3 long years. Inside the ranch house, which still bore all the feminine touches that Martha had added during their happier years together, Samuel gently placed the child in Martha's old rocking chair, the same chair where his beloved wife had nursed their twin boys through countless illnesses and sung them to sleep with lullabies. The little girl's feet were in far worse condition than he had initially realized. The soles were covered with angry blisters, some of which had already burst and were weeping clear fluid, while others remained swollen and tight with the promise of future agony. Working with a gentleness that surprised even himself, Samuel fetched cool water from his well and clean cloths from Martha's carefully organized linen chest. His hands, more accustomed to handling rope and branding irons, moved with surprising delicacy and care as he began the painstaking process of cleaning and bandaging the child's wounded feet. She endured the unavoidably painful treatment without so much as a whimper of complaint, watching him work with those remarkable green eyes that seemed to hold far too much wisdom and sorrow for someone so young. "What's your name, child?" Samuel asked softly as he wrapped the last of the clean cloth around her left foot, his voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that had once been used to calm frightened horses and soothe his own children during their worst nightmares. "Lucy," she replied in that same whisper, soft voice that seemed almost afraid to take up too much space in the world. "Lucy May Patterson." The surname Patterson struck a chord deep in Samuel's memory, causing him to pause in his ministrations and search through his recollections of recent conversations overheard in town. The Patterson name had come up more than once during hushed discussions among the local ranchers and farmers, usually accompanied by worried frowns and the kind of hushed voices that people used when discussing troubles that might be contagious. He recalled now that the Pattersons were homesteaders who had tried to establish themselves on some of the most marginal land in the territory, a patch of hard scrabble earth about 20 miles to the north, where even the most optimistic farmers would struggle to coax any kind of living from the reluctant soil. Word around town had been that they were having a desperately hard time of it, even before the current drought had settled over the region like a biblical curse. "Where's your family, Lucy May?" Samuel asked gently, though a growing sense of dread in the pit of his stomach suggested that he might not want to hear the answer to his question. For the first time since he had found her walking across the scorching ground, tears began to well up in Lucy May's remarkable eyes. But she fought against them with a strength of will that spoke of long and bitter practice in the art of holding back sorrow. Her small hands clenched into tiny fists as she struggled to find the words to explain what had driven her to undertake such a desperate and dangerous journey. "Mama's real sick," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the steady ticking of the mantel clock. "She can't get out of bed no more. Hasn't been able to for near on a week now, and she makes these terrible sounds when she tries to breathe, like there's something heavy sitting on her chest that won't let the air get through proper." Samuel felt his heart begin to sink as he recognized the symptoms she was describing, remembering all too clearly the way consumption had begun its cruel work on his own beloved family. starting with what had seemed like minor ailments before revealing its true, devastating nature. "Papa says it's just a bad cold that'll pass in time," Lucy May continued, her voice growing stronger as if speaking the truth was somehow liberating. "But I know it ain't no ordinary cold because I seen plenty of colds before, and they don't make people sleep so much during the day or look so gray and sunken around the eyes. Papa drinks the devil's water now," she continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. "More and more each day, and he gets real angry when he's been at the bottle for a while, angrier than he ever used to be back when things was better, and we still had hope that next year might be different." A familiar rage began building in Samuel's chest, the same protective fury that had driven him to take up arms during the war and defend his own family against every conceivable threat. This anger felt different, though, more complex because it was mixed with a growing sense of personal responsibility for this brave child who had somehow found her way to his door. "He hit Mama real hard yesterday," Lucy May whispered, and now the tears did begin to flow despite her heroic efforts to contain them. "Hit her right across the face with the back of his hand. And after that she wouldn't wake up proper, no matter how much I tried to shake her gentle, like and call her name. She just lays there breathing funny and making little moaning sounds sometimes. But her eyes don't open and she don't respond when I talk to her." Part of Samuel wanted to saddle his fastest horse immediately and ride hard to the Patterson place to have a very direct conversation with Lucy May's father about the proper treatment of women and children. Another part of him, the part that had grown cautious during his years of solitary grief, warned him that this was not his fight to fight, not his responsibility to shoulder. Yet as he looked at Lucy May Patterson, sitting in his dead wife's rocking chair with her small feet wrapped in Martha's old linens, her delicate chin raised in defiance against a world that had shown her precious little kindness, Samuel knew with absolute certainty that some choices in life were not really choices at all. "How long have you been walking, Lucy May?" he asked, though he suspected he could already guess the answer from the severe condition of her feet. "Since before the sun came up," she replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a routine chore rather than an epic journey. "I could see the smoke from your chimney sometimes when I climbed up on our roof to look around. So I knew someone lived over here somewhere even though it looked terrible far away. Mama always told me that when you're in real trouble and need help, you got to be brave enough to ask for it even if asking is scary, and even if you ain't sure the person you're asking is gonna say yes. She said that most people are good at heart and want to help when they can, but they can't help if they don't know there's trouble that needs fixing." The wisdom embedded in those simple words struck Samuel with the force of a revelation, reminding him of fundamental truths about human nature and community responsibility that he had somehow forgotten during his long years of self-imposed isolation. Martha would have loved this little girl immediately and completely, he realized with a pang of bittersweet recognition. That evening, after Lucy May had consumed what appeared to be her first substantial meal in several days and finally surrendered to exhaustion, Samuel found himself sitting alone on his front porch wrestling with his conscience beneath a canopy of unusually bright stars. The smart thing would be to take the child to town in the morning and let Sheriff Morrison or Reverend Campbell deal with the complexities of the situation. But as the hours passed and he listened to the coyotes singing across the moonlit desert, Samuel found his thoughts drifting back to a morning 13 years earlier when his own sons had been born. He remembered the overwhelming rush of feeling that had swept over him as he held those two tiny, perfect beings for the first time, the sudden understanding that there were now two small lives who would depend on him for absolutely everything. He had failed them when the consumption came, despite all his prayers and desperate effort. The guilt of that failure had been eating away at him ever since. Maybe this unexpected arrival of Lucy May Patterson represented an opportunity for redemption, a chance to succeed where he had previously failed so catastrophically. To prove that he was capable of making a real difference in the life of a child who desperately needed someone to believe in her. The sound of soft footsteps interrupted his brooding thoughts. Samuel turned to see Lucy May standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm yellow light from the parlor. She was wearing one of his old work shirts, which hung on her small frame like a tent, and her bandaged feet were carefully positioned to avoid putting weight on the worst injuries. "Mr. Samuel," she said hesitantly, "I can't sleep proper. Every time I close my eyes, I keep thinking about Mama lying there all still and gray looking, and I get scared that maybe she's already gone to heaven and I'm too late to help her." Samuel felt something twist painfully in his chest as he looked at this brave little girl who had undertaken an epic journey to save her mother, only to find herself tormented by the fear that her heroic efforts might have been in vain. Without saying a word, he patted the wooden chair beside him, and Lucy May carefully made her way across the porch to settle at his side. "Tell me about your mama," Samuel said gently. Sensing that she needed to talk about the woman who had clearly been the guiding light of her young life, Lucy May's entire face lit up with a smile that transformed her appearance completely, banishing the worry lines and revealing the happy child she might have been under different circumstances. "Mama's the best person in the whole world," she said with absolute conviction. "She used to be a real school teacher back in Missouri before she married Papa, and she knows how to read and write better than anybody I ever met. She taught me all my letters and numbers, and she can tell the most wonderful stories about faraway places and brave people who do important things when the world needs them most." "What kind of stories does she tell?" Samuel prompted gently. "All kinds of stories," Lucy May replied enthusiastically. "Stories about knights and princesses and dragons, but also stories about real people who lived in real places and did brave things when they had to. She told me about a lady named Clara who helped take care of soldiers during the big war, and about another lady named Harriet who helped people escape from slavery even when it was terrible dangerous. Mama always said that being brave don't mean you ain't scared of what might happen. It means you do what's right even when you're scared, especially when you're scared, because that's when doing right matters the most." The profound truth in those simple words hit Samuel like a revelation, reminding him of fundamental principles that he had somehow lost sight of during his long years of grief and self-protection. "Your mama sounds like a very special woman," Samuel said with genuine admiration. "She is," Lucy May agreed emphatically. "That's why I got to save her no matter what it takes. Papa used to be different, before everything went wrong and he started giving up hope. He used to laugh and tell funny stories and play games with me, and he never raised his voice or his hand to either of us." "What changed?" Samuel asked softly. "The crops failed 3 years running," Lucy May explained with clinical precision. "And then the well went dry, and then the few cattle we had got sick and died, and then the bank man started coming around asking about money we didn't have." The familiar litany of frontier disasters struck Samuel with recognition and sympathy. He had faced many of the same challenges himself, had felt the same crushing weight of accumulated setbacks. Papa started drinking a little at first, just in the evenings, saying it helped him sleep and forget about our troubles. But then he started drinking more and more, and during the daytime too, and the more he drank the angrier he got about everything that was going wrong. "What are you going to do with me?" Lucy May asked suddenly, her voice taking on a note of anxiety. "Are you going to take me back to Papa tomorrow and pretend like none of this ever happened?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, demanding an answer that Samuel knew he must provide. He understood what the law required, what social convention expected, but he also knew what his heart was telling him, and for the first time in 3 long years, Samuel Hartwell decided to listen to that inner voice. "No, Lucy May," he said quietly but with absolute conviction. "I'm not taking you back to a situation where you might be hurt, or where your mama might not get the help she desperately needs. Tomorrow morning we're going to hitch up my wagon and go collect your mama and bring her here where Doc Williams can take proper care of her." "What about Papa?" Lucy May asked, though there was more wariness than affection in her voice. "Your papa's going to have to make some hard choices about what kind of man he wants to be," Samuel replied firmly. "But in the meantime, you and your mama are going to be safe and cared for, and that's a promise I intend to keep." The next morning dawned clear and brutally hot. Samuel rose before dawn and spent the early hours preparing for what he knew would be a difficult journey. He hitched up his strongest wagon and loaded it with water, medical supplies, blankets, food, and everything else that might be needed for a complicated rescue mission. Lucy May emerged wearing the same patch dress, though Samuel had done his best to clean and mend it during the pre-dawn hours. Her feet were still too tender for boots, so he had fashioned thick cloth wrappings to provide protection against the rough wagon floor. "Are you ready for this, little one?" Samuel asked as he helped her climb onto the wagon seat beside him. "I've been ready since the day Papa started drinking and forgot that he was supposed to take care of his family," Lucy May replied with gravity that seemed both heartbreaking and inspiring. "Mama needs help real bad, and I'm the only one who can get it for her." The journey to the Patterson homestead took them across some of the most desolate country in Texas, land that had been marginal even in good times and was now virtually uninhabitable due to the extended drought. As they traveled through the increasingly barren landscape, Lucy May talked more about her family, painting a picture of people who had started with high hopes, but had been gradually worn down by the relentless pressures of frontier existence. When they finally reached the Patterson place, Samuel understood immediately why Lucy May had been so desperate to find help. The homestead was a monument to failure and despair, a collection of ramshackle buildings that looked ready to collapse. The main house was little more than a large shack constructed from rough lumber and chinked with mud that had cracked and fallen away, leaving gaps large enough for snakes and scorpions to enter. Broken bottles littered the yard like glittering fragments of shattered dreams, and the acrid stench of sickness and neglect hung heavy in the air. Inside the house, they found Lucy May's mother exactly as the child had described, unconscious on a filthy mattress, her breathing shallow and labored, her face bearing the purple and yellow bruises of a savage beating. Emma Patterson had once been beautiful, Samuel could see, but illness and hardship had aged her far beyond her years. Her skin had a grayish pallor that spoke of serious internal injuries, and her lips were cracked and dry from fever and dehydration. Lucy May's father was nowhere to be seen, though the sound of heavy snoring from a back room, combined with the overwhelming smell of cheap whiskey, suggested his location and condition. Samuel made a quick decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Without consulting anyone or seeking permission, he carefully lifted Emma Patterson in his strong arms and carried her out to his waiting wagon, while Lucy May gathered their few worthwhile belongings. "We're taking your mama to town," Samuel told her as he arranged blankets around the unconscious woman. "Doc Williams will know what to do for her, and will make sure she gets all the care she needs." The ride to town was agonizing. Emma Patterson drifted in and out of consciousness, and several times Samuel thought they might lose her entirely. Lucy May held her mother's hand and sang softly to her, old hymns and lullabies in a voice as sweet as spring rain. It was clear that despite everything, the bond between mother and daughter remained unbreakably strong. Doc Williams took one look at Emma Patterson and shook his head gravely. She had suffered a severe concussion along with internal injuries that were beyond his ability to treat properly. She might recover, but it would be a long, uncertain process requiring constant care and attention. "Someone needs to take responsibility for Lucy May," the doctor said quietly, pulling Samuel aside. "Her father is in no condition to care for anyone, least of all a child. I'll take her," Samuel heard himself saying, the words emerging before he had fully considered their implications, but feeling absolutely right the moment he spoke them. "Samuel," Doc Williams said gently, "are you sure about this? Taking in a child is a tremendous responsibility, especially given what you've been through with your own family." Samuel looked down at Lucy May, who was standing beside her mother's bed with tears streaming down her face but her chin raised defiantly against despair. In that moment, he saw something of his own boys in her courage, something of Martha in her fierce loyalty to family. "I'm sure," he said with complete conviction. The first few weeks were harder than Samuel had anticipated. Lucy May was a well-mannered child, eager to help and grateful for his kindness, but she carried deep wounds that went far beyond her burned feet. She woke screaming from nightmares, flinched whenever he raised his voice, and spent hours staring toward town where her mother lay fighting for her life. Samuel found himself learning to be gentle again, to speak softly and move carefully so as not to startle her. He taught her to gather eggs from the chickens, to help with simple chores around the ranch, and to read from the few books that Martha had treasured. In return, Lucy May brought something back into the house that had been missing for 3 long years, the sound of life itself. Her laughter, when it finally came, was like music after a long silence. Her questions about everything from why the sky was blue to how cattle knew which grass to eat reminded Samuel that the world was still full of wonder, even in its harshest corners. And her simple faith in the goodness of people, despite everything she had endured, began to chip away at the wall of cynicism that Samuel had built around his heart as protection against further loss. One evening, As they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Lucy May asked the question that Samuel had been expecting but still dreading. "But Samuel, what happens if Mama don't get better? What happens to me then?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead and thinking about the strange turns that life could take, the unexpected ways that loss and love could interweave to create something entirely new and precious. "Then we'll take care of each other," he said finally, the words carrying the weight of a sacred promise. "That's what families do, and that's what we are now, Lucy May. We're family? Are we really family now?" she asked, and there was such hope in her voice that it nearly broke his heart with its beauty and vulnerability. "I reckon we are," Samuel replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The crisis came 6 weeks later when Emma Patterson took a sudden turn for the worse. Doc Williams sent word that Lucy May should come to town immediately to say goodbye to her mother. Samuel hitched up the wagon with a heavy heart, knowing that the little girl who had walked barefoot across burning ground to ask for help was about to face the greatest loss of her young life. But Emma Patterson surprised everyone, including the doctor who had given up hope. When she saw her daughter's face, saw the love and stability that Samuel had provided, she summoned strength from some deep well of maternal determination that defied medical explanation. She lived through that critical night, and the next, and slowly began the long, difficult journey back to health. It was during this period of gradual recovery that Jeremiah Patterson finally made his appearance at the ranch. He came drunk and belligerent, demanding the return of what he called his woman and his girl. Samuel met him on the front porch with a loaded shotgun and a resolve that had been forged in war and tempered by loss and love. "They're under my protection now," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "And they're staying that way." Patterson was a big man, but he was also a coward at heart. Faced with Samuel's unwavering determination and the business end of a 12-gauge shotgun, he backed down quickly, but his parting words were venomous and threatening. "You can't keep what ain't yours forever, Hartwell. Blood is blood, and the law is the law. I'll be back with the sheriff, and then we'll see who has the right to decide what happens to my family." Samuel knew the man was right, at least technically. Texas law strongly favored the rights of fathers, even bad ones, and there would likely be a legal battle ahead. But he also knew that some laws were written in the heart rather than in books, and those were the ones that truly mattered when everything else was stripped away. The legal fight that followed was ugly and protracted. Patterson hired a lawyer from San Antonio and filed suit for the return of his wife and daughter. He cleaned himself up temporarily and presented himself to the court as a reformed man who had learned from his mistakes and wanted his family back. Samuel fought with everything he had, hiring his own attorney and bringing witness after witness to testify about Lucy May's condition when she had first arrived at his ranch, and about the improvements in both her and her mother's circumstances since then. But Texas law in 1887 was unforgiving in its support of paternal rights, and the judge seemed inclined to return the child to her father's custody, despite the evidence of abuse and neglect. It was Lucy May herself who ultimately tipped the scales of justice in their favor. On the final day of the hearing, the judge asked to speak with her privately in his chambers, to hear her own wishes about where she wanted to live and with whom. What exactly she said during that 20-minute conversation was never revealed, but when they emerged, the judge's face was grim and his decision was final and irrevocable. "Mr. Patterson," he said in a voice that carried the full weight of legal authority, "based on the evidence presented to this court and the testimony I have heard, including that of the child herself, you have forfeited your rights as a father through your actions and neglect. Custody of Lucy May Patterson is hereby granted permanently to Samuel Hartwell with Mrs. Patterson's full consent and approval." The celebration was necessarily brief because Emma Patterson's health, while much improved, remained fragile. It became clear that while she might live for months or even years with proper care, she would never be strong enough to care for Lucy May on her own or to resume the full responsibilities of motherhood. In a tearful but determined conversation with Samuel and her daughter, she made the request that had been building in her heart for weeks. "I want you to adopt her legally," Emma whispered from her bed in Doc Williams' clinic, her voice weak but her resolve absolutely clear. "She's got a real chance with you, Samuel. A chance to be something more than what I could ever give her in my condition." Promise me you'll love her like she was your own blood?" "I already do," Samuel replied without hesitation, and he meant every word with a depth of feeling that surprised even him. The adoption papers were signed on a crisp October morning, with Lucy May wearing a new dress that Samuel had bought specially for the occasion, and her feet protected by sturdy leather boots that fit perfectly. She was nervous but radiantly happy, chattering excitedly about their future together and all the things they would do on the ranch that was now truly their shared home. That evening, as they walked together around the property that belonged to both of them now, Lucy May asked Samuel to tell her about his first family. It was a conversation he had been avoiding, but her simple directness made evasion impossible and unnecessary. He told her about Martha, about her gentle strength and her beautiful voice when she sang hymns on Sunday mornings. He told her about James and Jacob, about their mischievous grins and their love of adventure and their dreams of becoming cowboys like their father. He told her about the sickness that had taken them all and about the dark months afterward when he had seriously considered giving up on life entirely. "But then you came walking across that burning ground," he said, lifting her up to sit on a fence rail so they could watch the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Barefoot and brave as any soldier I ever saw, asking if I could help you. But the truth is, Lucy May, you were the one helping me. You reminded me what it means to be needed by someone, what it means to have a purpose beyond just surviving from one day to the next." "How did I help you?" she asked with genuine puzzlement, unable to see herself as anything other than a burden that he had generously chosen to bear. "You brought life back into this old house and into this old man's heart," Samuel said with complete honesty. "You reminded me that love doesn't die just because people do, that it finds new places to grow and new ways to flourish if you're brave enough to let it." Lucy May considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Mama Emma told me once that sometimes, when people are taken from us, others come along to fill the empty spaces in our hearts. Do you think that's what happened with us?" Samuel looked up at the vast Texas sky, at the million stars scattered across the darkness like diamonds on black velvet, and thought about the mysterious ways that loss and love could interweave to create something beautiful and lasting. "I think," he said carefully, choosing his words with the precision that such profound questions demanded, "that sometimes terrible things happen that we don't understand and can't control. But I also think that love has a way of finding where it's needed most, and that the people who are meant to be together usually find each other somehow, even when the path that brings them together is painful and difficult." The years that followed were not without their challenges and setbacks. There were more droughts and market crashes that threatened the ranch's survival, and the constant struggle of raising a spirited girl in a harsh land that demanded strength and resilience from everyone who chose to call it home. But Lucy May grew into a young woman of remarkable character and capability, strong like her mother but tempered by the wisdom that comes from surviving hardship and emerging stronger. She learned to ride like a cowboy, shoot like a soldier, and think like a successful rancher. But she never lost the compassion that had driven her to walk barefoot across burning ground to ask for help when help was desperately needed. She became known throughout the county for her kindness to those in need, often bringing food to struggling families or tending to sick animals with the same gentle care that Samuel had once shown her. Emma Patterson lived for 7 more years, long enough to see her daughter graduate from the territorial school and become a woman of substance and character who was respected and loved by everyone who knew her. She died peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning, with Lucy May holding her hand and Samuel standing quietly in the doorway, offering his presence as comfort and his strength as support. At the funeral, people remarked on how blessed Emma had been to have such a devoted daughter and such a caring friend in Samuel. But Samuel knew the truth was far more complex and beautiful than that simple observation suggested. They had all saved each other in different ways, had created a family from the broken pieces of their individual lives and forged bonds that were stronger than blood because they had been chosen rather than simply inherited. Years later, when Lucy May finally did marry a good man named David Morrison who understood that his wife came with deep roots and unbreakable loyalties, she and Samuel remained as close as any father and daughter could possibly be. Her children grew up knowing the story of how their mother had once walked barefoot across burning ground to ask a stranger for help, and how that single act of desperate courage had changed 3 lives forever and created a family that existed not because of shared blood, but because of shared love and mutual commitment. Samuel lived to be an old man, long enough to see his adopted grandchildren take their first steps and speak their first words and begin to understand the difference between right and wrong. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the Texas sun was setting and the air was still and peaceful, he would sit on his front porch and remember a little girl with auburn hair and remarkable green eyes, walking steadily across the scorching earth toward his door with nothing but courage and hope to sustain her. She had asked if he could help her, but the truth was more beautiful and complex than either of them could have understood at the time. In helping her, he had helped himself find a reason to live again. In saving her, he had been saved from a life of meaningless solitude and regret. And in the end, that barefoot journey across burning ground had led them all to exactly where they were meant to be, home, together, forever bound by the kind of love that chooses itself and grows stronger with each passing day. The Broken Arrow Ranch still stands today, its name now carried by Lucy May's descendants who continue to work the same land that once seemed cursed by drought and sorrow, but was transformed by love into something fertile and lasting. And if you know where to look, you can still see the faint outline of the path that a brave little girl once walked, her bare feet carrying her toward hope across ground so hot it could burn. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the longest journeys begin with the simplest words, "Can you help me?" And sometimes, in answering that question with an open heart and willing hands, we discover that the person we're really helping is ourselves.